because shocks to electricity grids happen all the time. The question is, how bad does the shock have to be to cause a blackout? And what renewables do is they undermine that robustness. They make the grid dramatically more vulnerable so that it takes a smaller shock to trigger the initial blackout. They also mean that the blackout spreads much faster and much further than it did. And they also make it extremely difficult to restart the grid when such a blackout occurs. And Spain has been an absolute textbook case example of all of those things, which means the people who have been pointing out that the grid is very, very vulnerable for a very long time have been spot on. The debate is focused, as you say, on what actually triggered the issue, but that's not the point.
Remember when experts warning about blackouts from renewable energy were laughed at? Well, nobody's really laughing in Spain right now, just 2 weeks after celebrating powering the entire country with renewables for a single day. Spain experienced Europe's largest blackout. Now, Nick Hubble's latest Fat Tail Daily piece explores what this moment actually means for the future of energy policy worldwide. What's particularly fascinating is how this blackout has vindicated predictions made years ago by analysts like our very own Jim Rickards. Back in 2022, Jim actually warned in Strategic Intelligence Australia, he warned to subscribers that wind and solar cannot power the grid and that Europe's choices will be rationing and blackouts. Well, that seems to be exactly what's happened. And now we're potentially witnessing a seismic shift in global energy policy. So, Nick, welcome, mate. It's been a while.
Yeah, it's good to be back.
Yeah, so look, let's start with something fundamental. You've drawn a distinction between what triggered Spain's blackout and the real issue at hand. Could you explain why focusing on the initial cause of the blackout misses the bigger picture about grid vulnerability?
Yeah, for many years, decades actually, Jim Rickards has pointed out that you don't blame a snowflake for the avalanche. You blame the snowpack, the shape of the situation before that snowflake drops. And it's the same story with electricity grids. You don't blame the particular lightning strike that hits or the particular burst of energy or the particular drop in energy or whatever it is that happened in Spain and so many other places that came close to experiencing what Spain has in the last few years. You blame how vulnerable or robust the grid is to those sorts of shocks, because shocks to electricity grids happen all the time. The question is, how bad does the shock have to be to cause a blackout? And what renewables do is they undermine that robustness. They make the grid dramatically more vulnerable so that it takes a smaller shock to trigger the initial blackout. They also mean that the blackout spreads much faster and much further than it did. And they also make it extremely difficult to restart the grid when such a blackout occurs. And Spain has been an absolute textbook case example of all of those things, which means the people who have been pointing out that the grid is very, very vulnerable for a very long time have been spot on. The debate is focused, as you say, on what actually triggered the issue, but that's not the point.
Look, you mentioned how politicians are starting to now back away from aggressive net zero targets. And you mentioned Tony Blair calling them doomed to fail, to Norway's upcoming election where cutting ties with the EU grid is on the ballot. Do you see this as a temporary reaction or the beginning of a fundamental shift? And I know, obviously, I don't know if this interview will be looked at by most people post-election here too. So it's a big topic here as well.
Yeah, the blackouts came too late to save Canada's Conservative politician in that election. The question is whether it's going to save Peter Dutton here. We don't know. What we do know is that polls in places like Germany have shifted towards renewable skeptics. They've shifted very heavily towards renewable skeptics in the UK, where the Conservative Party leader has said that net zero is impossible. And then the leading person in the polls is Nigel Farage, who's been a renewable skeptic, who actually predicted these blackouts in videos that I recorded with him in past years for the specific reasons of these renewables issues. And we wrote newsletters together about those topics. So he's leading the polls in the UK. And so the list goes on. All these places, the polls are shifting dramatically towards those who are more skeptical. The most important one is Norway, because in Norway, it's become mainstream politics to threaten to disconnect the Norwegian electricity grid from other countries around Europe. And the issue is that those countries rely specifically on Norway because Norway has a lot of hydropower. Unfortunately, in Norway, if you use hydropower, you also waste the country's water reserves. And so there's been some political issues about droughts there, which mean that the voters and the politicians don't want to connect their water supply and their power supply to the rest of Europe's messed up grid. And so on, I think it's the 8th of September, sometime early in September, the Norwegians have an election. It's likely that political parties that want to disconnect or restrict power exports will win. And from that point on, all of the energy ministers around Europe will have to explain to their people how they're going to power the grid when the sun's not shining and the wind's not blowing. For many, many years, they've been saying from Norway, and they've built the interconnected cables. If that's no longer there, it becomes extremely unclear how they can justify a renewables rollout. And so our warning in Strategic Intelligence Australia for a very long time has been to avoid renewables because of this risk as governments turn away and they start to realize from hard experience what it means to try and roll out renewables. That's when suddenly all this risk of blackouts and other issues suddenly pop up and force them to change direction. In Australia, we've had, I think, recently a massive increase in the estimated cost of building the grid needed to make renewables look viable. I think it's more than $100 billion as the latest. And so these projects, once the costing is in, everyone starts to go, wait, this isn't going to work. We don't want to pay that much because it means renewables do become more expensive than the alternative option. So it's very easy to ignore the consequences of transitioning to renewables until you actually do it. And then when you get blackouts in Spain, you get cost overruns, you get all these dramatic issues, frequency issues, inertia issues, all these things that we've talked about for years in Strategic Intelligence Australia. All of a sudden, those problems are very real and in front of you. It's a bit like those surveys where people get asked, do you want to do something about climate change? Do you support renewables? People will say yes. But as soon as they're asked how much they're willing to pay to support these efforts, the favorability rating reverses. We're now experiencing those costs. That's why the shift is coming.
Yeah. You actually highlight an interesting paradox. Regions with more cheap renewable energy often have higher electricity prices, which kind of goes to what you're saying. But what explains this counterintuitive relationship? And what does it tell us about the economics of the energy transition?
Yeah, it's all about how you count and how you measure costs, right? Because the issue with renewables is they're cheap and effectively free at the margin, but they have all these enormous fixed costs. The grid you have to build, the storage you need, to deal with the intermittency, you need a bigger grid interconnected across greater distances. All these other types of issues, you need the backup power plants, which have been gas at the moment. Those costs are usually not included in the comparisons, right? So if you think about how you measure costs to include a broader spectrum of the implied costs, you start to see that renewables are more expensive. The fraud that's happening right now is that when these comparisons are done, especially in Australia, the analysts who are looking at it assume the fixed cost of building the grid needed to support renewables is going to happen anyway. The key advantage of transitioning to something like nuclear is you don't need to build the grid. So if you assume the grid is going to be built anyway, then you're not gaining the key advantage of using nuclear over renewables. So you need to somehow tie up the cost of a renewables-based system, which includes an enormous grid, includes the storage, includes the backup systems, or just a nuclear. And what we've discovered from the Spanish blackouts is that there's a whole bunch of other costs that are related to relying on renewables, such as the time it takes to get the grid up, the risk that the grid is going to go down, how far the blackout can spread, and how fast it can spread. One of the big issues with renewables is that they have no inertia, which is literally just the inertia of a turbine spinning.
Yeah.
So if there's no sun or no wind, all of a sudden, the power supply goes to zero. Whereas on a hydroelectric plant or a gas plant or a coal plant or a nuclear plant, the turbine continues spinning even if you cut off its power source, which gives the grid operators a long time to figure out where they should draw power from instead. One of the things that happened in Spain is the cut was so fast and that caused it to spread so fast that no one could deal with it in time. So that's another hidden cost. It's not included in the cost of transitioning to renewables. This is a good example of how these analyses have been misleading, and especially during this election campaign. That's been a really big issue in Australia right now. That's why we're asking whether this Spanish blackout could actually move polls here in Australia at the very last minute. The European media, if Australians were reading it, would probably move polls significantly. I don't know if Australia's coverage of what happened in Spain is going to be enough.
I was thinking it's quite funny anyway how you can have a big celebration or big milestone and then bang, next day. You're just jinxing it, aren't you?
Yeah, well, there's a whole bunch of that going on. The
Yeah.
celebration of the first working day in Spain that was fully renewables powered was actually my birthday.
All right.
So, it was awkward for me, having predicted all these blackouts alongside Jim, that they managed to get to 100% on my birthday. And sure enough, 2 weeks later, as we anticipated, it caused a big problem for them.
Mm.
My in-laws living in Barcelona were actually caught out. One of the interesting things that happened is you can manage an electricity grid if you know what demand is going to be, right? And usually demand is very predictable over time. The trouble is that if you experience a blackout, it's an unusual situation. So it's very difficult to anticipate what demand is going to be. So the moment the lights come on, everyone in the UK would turn on the kettle to make a cup of tea, right?
Yeah.
Whereas in Spain, like, what's the equivalent? Like, we don't know how fast demand is going to come back. So one of the problems they experienced is that as they turned on the grid, demand did very unpredictable things. Now, if you've got a gas or a nuclear power plant or whatever it might be, you can match that unpredictable demand spike and drop by increasing the amount of power output. If you're doing it with renewables, you can't control renewables in that way. You don't know how much they're going to produce or not produce, especially because it actually nighttime fell just as they're trying to get up the grid. So their vast amounts of solar, having not charged the batteries that day because of the outage, got them into trouble, right? So there's all these weird, ironic, unpredictable things that pop up where we're just not used to dealing with this in terms of how we run our electricity system. And now that they've been exposed, all of these other governments and countries are going to have to incorporate that. So can you restart your electricity grid in the middle of the night if you're relying on 70% solar? It's an unknown question. Now we know it's pretty darn difficult. You need to have all these gas and coal and nuclear plants still running. The big question is what governments will come up with instead. And that's really what the article I wrote about focuses on, is now the governments are going to have to respond to the problems that we predicted would occur. How are they going to respond? What's the response going to be? What's the energy system going to look like in the future?
Well, that's really my next question, actually. Looking beyond the critique of renewables, one of the things you raised, you raise a crucial question of what replaces them. You mentioned nuclear, but can you walk us through, why don't you walk us through the main contenders, like whether it's nuclear, natural gas, or storage technologies? And where do you see the most promising investment opportunities out of those things?
Over the last few years, we've seen companies that rely on electricity sort of try and go their own way in producing electricity for themselves. And initially, they were all building small modular reactor plants.
Yeah.
Right? There's all these companies in the US saying, the grid's too unreliable, the cost spikes and drops all over the place. We're going to build our own small modular reactor. As they've realized how difficult that is, they've actually transitioned to gas power plants instead. So there's a couple of companies building gas power plants to power their own data centers. Importantly, these are largely off the grid. They're designed to power a data center 24/7. They're not connected. They're not going to continue operating. I think that's kind of what's happening here, is the world's business people, some politicians discovering that relying on the grid is risky. It's expensive, blackouts, it's all interconnected. So when something goes wrong on the other side of the continent, it can spread to. So what they're doing is coming up with their own ways. Gas is the obvious one, especially in the short term, because it ticks all the boxes and we're very good at and used to doing that. Recently, sales of gas turbines for certain companies that we've written about actually in Strategic Intelligence Australia have soared. That shouldn't be happening if we're transitioning to renewables. Right? Why are people buying turbines instead of solar panels and windmills? So the gas is the most likely one. The key issue that remains, if you're looking at the larger scale picture rather than these small modular type situations where people are cutting themselves off the grid in order to be independent, is that, like I said earlier, if you're going to continue to have a lot of renewables on the grid, you need to have all this infrastructure. You need to have all this storage. You need to have all this stuff. And at that point, many of the other sources of energy don't become cost effective. So if you have a nuclear power plant, its power is reasonably cheap as long as it's going all the time, as much as it possibly can. If you only use it half the time, then the cost per unit of power is very high. It's very expensive. That's one of the cheap tricks that the analysts in Australia pulled when they analysed nuclear power. They said, we're going to have so much solar and wind, we won't need all the nuclear power that we can produce. Therefore, its cost per unit of output is going to be very high. So unless you get rid of renewables, many of the other sources of electricity actually don't make sense. It's not economical to have a gas plant that only runs 10 to 20% of the time.
Yep.
right? Just as it's not economical to do much of anything that only gets used a small fraction of the time. Same for batteries, right? If your battery is only getting used a very small amount of time because it's only when there's an outage or when there's an unpredictable cloud or whatever it might be, all of that becomes uneconomical. So renewables introduce a really messed up set of incentives. Imagine if you're pitching to build a nuclear or gas power plant, and the electricity price is going to be negative most days because there's so much solar and wind on the grid. No one's going to invest in that. No one's going to do it, right? So it's a really bizarre electricity grid situation that we've introduced. And until all of this actually started going wrong in practice, which it now has in a way that no one can ignore, there was no real incentive to say, look, this isn't working. There was no real incentive to listen to the experts that said all along, this isn't going to work. But now that's all changed. And so the question is going to be, to what extent will we go against renewables in order to make other sources of energy viable, right? And so that's why these renewables stocks are so dangerous right now, because in order to come up with a sensible energy system that is going to be cheap and stable and all these other things that we need, we're going to have to get rid of renewables. It's going to have to be an extremely small part of the electricity grid. And that's a radical shift. So I'm talking not just about a greater role for nuclear or a greater role for gas or whatever it might be. I'm saying that if we have, I don't know what the percentage is, but if we have a significant amount of renewables, everything starts to get really messed up in all sorts of weird and wonderful ways.
So just two takeaways that I'm getting from this then: avoid renewable stocks and look into potentially those companies investing in new gas plants, things like that.
Yeah, anyone who's sort of identified all of this and said, look, things are so bad that we're going to have to sort our own electricity supply. So the small knowledge of the nuclear reactors and the companies that are able to cater to gas plants on quite a small scale. So the companies that provide mining, remote mining sites with power are a good example of that.
Fantastic. All right, Nick, we'll leave it there. That's a nice little takeaway for people to dig into. Good to talk to you again, and we'll do it again very soon. Thank you, mate.
Sounds good.